Thank you for having me. Thank you for that introduction. Appreciate it very much. It's good to be here. It's good to be with people interested in knowing a little bit more about how to make our remote meetings work a little better. Before I start that, it was mentioned that I'm an industrial organizational psychologist. And for those of you who don't know what that is, that's not a surprise. That's okay. That's a mouthful too, frankly. An industrial organizational psychologist is someone who takes psychological theories and principles, like you might learn in your Psych 101 classes, right? And applies them to the world of work. So thinking about our psychology doesn't stay at home. Excuse me, doesn't just stay at home. It comes with us to the office. It comes with us to the plant. It comes with us to wherever we may go. And those psychological processes matter to how we work. And so that's what an industrial organizational psychologist does. It tries to understand the psychology of the workplace. So me, and in particular, I focus on workplace meetings. So I'm going to share some slides here for a few minutes, and there'll be some interaction that we'll get to do here in a minute in relation to this. So let me go ahead and get these going. Okay. So hopefully you can see my slides, correct? Somebody wave at me. They got a thumbs up from Clemente and others. So I think we're good to go. All right. So I'm going to talk about Suddenly Virtual. It's a book that I just released with my co-author, Karen Reed, but it's really focusing on the research that I've done on virtual meetings that has happened since, primarily since the pandemic has occurred. And I consider myself a meeting scientist. So I'm an IO psychologist, but most of my work, not entirely, but most of my work has been focused on workplace meetings. And so I call myself a meeting scientist. And my Twitter is at meetings doctor, because I'm all about how do we make our meetings more effective. And so let's get a little interaction here. First, in the chat, describe what meetings were like for you in October of 2019. Okay. So I'll give you a second to do that. Oh, I'm clicking when I shouldn't be. There we go. All right, let's see what we got in the chat. If I can get that to show up for me. The chat does not want to show up for me. So why is that not showing up for me? I apologize. Here we are learning about virtual meetings and I can't even see the chat. Let me stop sharing so that way maybe I could see it. Okay, there it is. So yeah, great. So in person only, in person, interactive, structured, all in person, long in all sorts of places around campus, informal conversation before and after the meeting, right? That's nice. Long, very challenging to be organized and on target. Could feel the vibe. Okay, so when maybe because that you were in person, you could feel how people were doing or feel the vibe of the room. Harder to feel that now in a virtual environment. Yeah. So now let's switch gears. Thank you for those comments. That's great. Really, really helpful. Let's hear what was meetings like for you in May of 2020. So how are things different in May of 2020 as compared to October of 2019? And go ahead and put those in the chat. So we got clinical and remote. Thank you, Nicola. 2D, nice. Who was that? That was, Teresa. Thank you. Yes, that's right. 2D. Shorter and on Zoom, more isolating. No interaction. More efficient, more focused. Okay. Yeah. Hard to have a conversation though. Okay. You're on mute became the most common phrase. I think there was actually a few different word clouds I've seen on various websites where they've analyzed the dialogue of virtual meetings and whether it's true or not, the biggest thing in the word cloud was you're on mute, right? All online, a less opportunity for small talk, right? Virtual, right? Mary, in May 2020, all meetings were virtual via Zoom and Microsoft Teams, and a lot of people spent a lot of time getting used to the interface. Yep, very hard for anyone to contribute. Mostly talking heads, which I apologize for being a talking head, but hopefully this is helpful for a little interaction, and we'll get more in a little bit here. So great, thank you for that. That's helpful. That kind of helps you understand or helps you think about and reflect on, okay, what were our experiences before the pandemic? What were our experiences in the midst of the pandemic? And hopefully as we transition out, if that's indeed what we're able to do now, there's going to be a different, things are going to change once more. And the question is, how is that going to look? And we'll think about that and talk about that a little bit later. Let me go back to my slides now and share some things that I learned in comparing those two time periods. So let me get this over here. There we go. All right. So I was lucky enough to decide, because I'd been studying meetings for about 10 or 15 years prior to October 2019. And for whatever reason, I decided that it was time for me to study virtual meetings. Now, this was, again, a few months before the pandemic. And so I was like, well, I want to study this because I was doing it a lot, because I had a lot of colleagues, I have a lot of colleagues that I work with across the country, around the world, and so forth. And so I launched a survey in October, and then I did a follow-up survey in May, because like, okay, things have changed, right? And it was fascinating to see the differences. So I'm going to share some of those now. So pre-COVID, so this is October 2019, almost 80% of our meetings are face-to-face. Based on your comments, seems like that pretty much aligns pretty well, right? 3% video, 5% telephone, 13% hybrid, which we defined hybrid for our respondents about this combination of virtual and face-to-face. So maybe you have 2 or 3 people in a room, you've got a couple people on video, maybe you got a couple people on the phone, something like that. So that's hybrid, okay? Post-COVID, and post-COVID may not be the right term, but during COVID, right? This was May 2019. 60% on video. And I think that's actually a little low compared to what your comments indicated, but video or telephone, but if you combine video and telephone, that's 85% of our meetings. We're now in a more virtual or non-face-to-face format, right? 11% remain face-to-face. And what we looked at, we actually kind of dug a little deeper and realized, oh, those are people who are like medical workers, right? They're still having meetings because they're talking about a patient, right? So that makes sense. They're face-to-face because they're about to, face-to-face, relatively speaking, because they've got all their gear on. But they're there together, right? And so it's face-to-face. 2% hybrid. It was kind of fascinating to see how hybrid also dropped to very low numbers as well, which was interesting. So then we started to look at length, right? Did the length of the meetings change? And yes, they did. Now you're probably thinking, oh, this is probably just a function of the Zoom 40-minute free account thing. And the answer is actually no, it's not. We controlled for that. We as well as other freemium apps that had a limit on time. We controlled for those characteristics. And so what we found is that pre-COVID we were close to an hour, and during COVID it reduced a bit. We were down to 40 minutes in the face-to-face meeting, but down 5 minutes shorter in the video meeting, even, right, during the COVID timeframe. So the meetings got a little bit shorter, not dramatically so in most cases, but they did get a little shorter, and they got a little smaller, which was kind of fascinating. That the face-to-face meeting got smaller, teleconference, video conference, they all ended up being a little bit smaller, except for the hybrid, which was a little fascinating, but we're not exactly sure what was going on there. And so these were kind of some of the effects. And so what does this all mean? Well, new challenges, technology, right? You're on mute, or you're not sharing properly, or I can't see the chat. It's I got to, like I just had, right? So technology, new challenges, work-family conflict. There were some studies out during COVID where we found out that people are working longer hours and have 1 or 2 more meetings per week than they had previous to COVID. Right, so work-family conflict is this idea that you're having some of this spillover, right? If you're working longer hours, then you might very well be working into the evening or early in the morning, where you might have had interactions with your family that you're no longer having or having less of. Electronic meeting fatigue, right? That started to be discussed a lot, and it's been verified, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail in a second here. But this also meant new opportunities, right? It's fun. You watch these Microsoft Teams commercials about these entrepreneurs and these companies that are actually being able to sell more of their products and services because they're able to reach more people, right? So we can work from more places. We can reach more people through services and that sort of thing out to others. There's more flexibility. I can have a meeting from my couch, from my kitchen table, or from luckily my office in my home, or anywhere else where you can get an internet connection, assuming you're not around other people, right? That was the reality pre-vaccination, right? So these were some of the changes that happened as a result of meetings being shifting and suddenly virtual. But then we hear this Zoom fatigue. We mentioned this briefly, but it's real, right? There was a study out from, I think it was it Harvard or Stanford, one of the two, looking at how seeing yourself on camera it creates a fight or flight response, right? You get more anxious and more nervous, that sort of thing. The study, the data that I collected actually said it was more about emotional labor, right? So emotional labor is humans' ability to regulate our emotions. Okay, so it's our ability to feel happy when we need to feel happy, or feel sad when we need to feel sad. Think about how you maybe empathize with someone who's lost a loved one, or maybe getting excited about someone who's gotten a promotion that you got passed over for. When your feelings inside are different from what you're required to express, it's effortful, right? And so it's a new job demand. And so if you're also at home and your kids are online trying to do classes and they're coming in and out, and you're supposed to have a meeting and you're supposed to be excited and enthusiastic and peppy as you're meeting with your boss, and yet you're in the middle of a pandemic, you can imagine that inwardly you're not feeling great and outwardly, but you're having to express these positive emotions. Emotional labor, that's what that is. And it's consistent with job demands resources. This is a new demand placed on more people in this particular situation. And humans, we have a finite amount of resources. We can't keep going forever. Our cognitive, physical, and emotional resources do get used up, and then we need an opportunity to recover. And that's what clocking out at the end of the day and finding our favorite beverage and watching hopefully some television show or reading a book or whatever you need to do to recharge. We do that, right? But as these demands continue to be upon us, we experience stress, right, or burnout if it is chronic, right? So if successful, feelings of accomplishment emerge. If we're successful in navigating this, we're like, yeah, wow, we get it. If not, we experience some stress and some Zoom fatigue or some electronic meeting fatigue or any number of other types of stress that have started to emerge as a result of this additional demand on our physical and emotional and cognitive resources. So we're focusing a little bit on this emotional labor thing. One particular type of emotional labor is called surface acting, and that's this putting last thing on a smile when you don't really feel like smiling. You ever worked with, checking out at the register and you're like, the person's smiling at you, you're like, that is not real. And you can tell it, right? That's the fake smile. That's surface acting. That's portraying an emotion that you're pretty sure is not consistent with how you actually feel, right? Pre-COVID, and this is on a scale of 1 to 5, okay? So pre-COVID, a little bit lower than post-COVID. Now you might think, well, that's not that big of a difference. Well, in the research, that's about a full standard deviation difference, right? So in non-statistical terms, that's a big difference, okay? And so we were doing more of that in May of 2020 than were doing in October of 2019, okay? And that's partly a result of being in the middle of a pandemic, being required to continue to work and to continue to be positive in the midst of an environment that's not generally positive, right? And so there's that inconsistency, more surface acting was happening, creating more of that Zoom fatigue. So what do we do about all this? We got this virtual environment, we've got Zoom fatigue going on, we've got a pandemic. Well, some things I can help with. I'm not a doctor that does vaccines, so I can't help with that, and I'm not sure how we would do it anyway in this virtual environment. But we can talk about how to make our meetings a little bit better and maybe reduce some of that stress. So I'm going to share three things. There's lots more we could talk about, and I'm happy to answer questions as we get to them. And if you want more suggestions or more tips, the first one is recognizing that need for recovery. On average, a person needs 17 minutes to recover from a bad meeting. Okay, and this is across almost 10,000 data points. Okay, we asked them, how much time do you need to recover from a bad meeting? and the average was 17 minutes. And we took out the people who said 24 hours. Okay, so these are the legit answers. Okay, so people need time to recover, and on average, people are doing more emotional labor in their meetings than ever before, and people need that time. And so we need to give it to them. Allow yourself the time to recover. And so one of the things that I often recommend people is, okay, you've got your hour-long meetings and you got your 30-minute meetings, and you got this default in your Outlook or in your Google account or whatever that forces you to, or not forces you, but defaults into these patterns of 30 minutes or half an hour, or an hour or whatnot. My advice to you is don't be a default. Hour-long meetings, make them 50 minutes. 30-minute meetings, make them 25. Okay. What that does for you is it allows you to go to the bathroom. It allows you to refresh your beverage, right? It allows you to arrive on time for your next meeting, because if you're like me, multiple days a week, you have back-to-back meetings, right? And if you have back-to-back meetings in an hour and an hour and an hour, or 30 minutes, 30 minutes, 30 minutes, 30 minutes, when are you going to find the restroom? Are you going to arrive on time to those meetings? If you actually, do get a beverage or do need to use the restroom or do need to be a human. And so because of that, if you build it in, if you take control of your schedule, and when you're calling a meeting, build in a little recovery time, okay? Give people that 5 minutes. And I have been really surprised, and maybe I shouldn't have been, but really surprised that when I've been the one that's called the meeting, when I've been able to make it a 45-minute meeting instead of an hour long, people have said, "Thank you, Joe. I'm so glad. I thought this was an hour meeting, and now I've got 15 minutes. What am I going to do?" And I'm like, "You could go to the restroom. You could get a drink. You could maybe grab a bite to eat." And they're like, "Wait, I can do those things?" So having those moments of realization that they can actually do some of that recovering, making them that much more effective for the next meeting. Okay. Otherwise, cognitively, they're not ready to switch. Without going too far into the neuroscience of this, we do know that our brains need a moment. When we go from one complex issue to another complex issue, it's cognitively taxing. And so in order to do that, we actually need a moment for our brain to go from this thing over here to this thing over here. So this recovery time serves an additional purpose of making people actually possibly prepared for the next meeting. So number 2, engage in the best practices. And I put ... 2019. That's because in some of my recent studies, we found that 80% of the pre-COVID best practices still apply. And here's a list, and I could keep going and going on this list. Meeting with purpose, scheduling the right meeting length, starting and ending on time, having the right number of people in the room, setting clear goals, preparing and using an agenda, engaging in procedural communication, avoiding complaining, avoiding distractions, encouraging. These are all things we all know. These have been in the meeting science and in the meeting practice literature for years. But so too often we don't abide by them. Too often we don't use them. But 80% of them still apply, because 80% of nothing I listed there referred to lighting or seating or refreshments or video conference room setup. Those still, we need to consider those, and we'll talk about those in a second. But 80% of the stuff that we knew before still applies. So dig out that old dusty, best practices, list you might have from how you make your meetings better. Most of it's still going to work. Okay. Number 3, engage in best practices 2020 plus. Okay. So this is referring to the new best practice I mentioned that would still apply in 2019, but wasn't really as big of an issue as it is now, but reducing our meeting times by about 10%. So taking that 60-minute meeting, making it 50, 55 minutes, something like that, 30-minute meeting, making it 25, that sort of thing. Okay. That recovery time is really important. Other things, embrace the ideas of on-camera optimization. We're now on camera. And if you're doing a presentation or if you're engaging with others, you do not want to, if you can, you want to avoid things that are going to distract from you communicating, right? Because you have, I'm doing hand gestures, I'm leaning, I'm doing a lot more interacting that way, because I know that if you see those things, those are nonverbal cues that you can see. But if my camera's at a weird angle, or if I have a window in my background, I'm not pointing on anyone in particular. I'm just saying, if you have these distractions, it's harder for your message, whatever it is, to be received. Okay. And so your production value, there's a reason. So it's funny. When I wrote this book, I wrote it with Karen Reed, who's a Emmy-winning former news anchor. And so she knows a ton about production value. And I remember when I first started talking to her, she said, my desk sat over here a little ways, and there was a window and a lamp, and there was some stuffed animals. So if you didn't see what you see in this screen, you would see that the rest of my world has some distractions, right? And so what she said, hey, do those bookshelves go all the way to the wall over there? I'm like, yeah. Why don't you move your desk over a little bit? And she said, oh, maybe you should put some things that are, in your background that reflect the things that you do. And I'm like, oh, so I should put like the Encyclopedia of Biopsychology over here, and I should put my new book right here. So she gave me some tips on how to make my production value not distract from me, but also reflect me, right? And so making sure that your framing is good, making sure that your video and audio quality are good. So I use these headphones whenever I do a presentation. I don't like them very much because I don't like having the pressure on my ears. And so when you meet with me and I'm not doing a presentation, I'm probably going to not be wearing these. But I wear these during a presentation because there's a road right out my window here that is really quite loud. And if I don't have something like this, every now and then you'd hear, a car go by, and they're building up the hill, so you hear really loud trucks go by, and there's no way to avoid that, right? With the way the sound is set up in this particular environment. So I wear these to, again, improve the audio quality, so that way you hear me and you see me, and whatever I'm saying hopefully reaches you in a more effective way. So then there's also using collaboration tools effectively. That's the third thing in this number 3 best practices of 2020. And there's a lot of them that have been really kind of coming onto the market now. Lots of development, lots of startups, lots of companies trying to say, hey, try our new tool, right? That's why the last word in that little bullet there is effectively, okay? Because not all of them are going to be effective. Not everyone's going to know how to use them. So you can't just say, oh, we're going to use this new collaboration tool and it's going to be great, and you just start doing it. There's going to be a bunch of people on your call and be like, I don't even know what this is, right? So if you want to use a collaboration tool, believe me, they can be very, very effective if you introduce it and you train people on how to use it, and then you work and then you do it long enough that it becomes second nature in your meetings to co-create using these collaboration tools. But if you don't train your team or your group to do it, or you try to use it with people who are not used to it, it's probably not going to go very well. Okay, so again, collaboration tools are great, but think about it before you implement it, and think about how best to do it, and also think about, is this a long-term team? And if it is, collaboration tools are probably a good idea. If this is just a short-term, we're going to meet 2 or 3 times and that's it, collaboration tools may be harder to implement than they're worth, right? Because they may or may not be familiar with the tool. If everyone's like, yeah, I got this, I've done this particular tool before, then go for it. But just be very smart about how you implement the collaboration tools. So those are the 3 big things that I want to mention in terms of recommendations that you might want to consider. Also, don't hesitate to take advantage of opportunities. I'm always looking for great new partners for the Center for Meeting Effectiveness that I direct. We do observation and feedback services. We do best practice reflection workshops where you think about your previous meetings and you write down the good and bad things you do and figure out how to implement them moving forward. We have partners that we work with in the software world that I might recommend or might not recommend depending on your situation. You can also partner with startups and other established organizations in the domain of collaboration and meetings. So there's Meeting Science, Klaxoon, Zoom. Microsoft has a lot of neat new tools. Collaborating with them or working with them to augment your meetings, I'm sure they'd be happy to sell you their wares, that sort of thing. But more importantly, there are opportunities for expanding your capabilities in the virtual environment. And if you want more, you're welcome to reach out to me for more insomnia curing research. I have plenty of it I can share with you. But the book, I hope, is not insomnia curing. Hopefully it's a little more entertaining, and that's the link to my website where you can find that if you're interested, if you'd like to hear more about this. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen because that's probably enough and you're tired of hearing me talk. And there you go. So what questions do you have for me?
Hello.
Yep.
Yes. So for me, my challenge is I'm very tech savvy. So I love
Sure.
technology and using many different things. And even up today where I, try to introduce people to new tools to spice things up.
Yep.
I feel the resistance of trying something new, even though it may be 10 times better, with
Yeah.
that. So, a lot of my students are Zoom fatigue.
Yeah.
They're tired of this Zoom model,
Hmm.
and I would introduce new tools. And it's like I have to create the buy-in for the higher
Yeah.
administrators to get it, to explain like, hey, the students are tired of
Hmm.
Zoom. Let's do Run
Let's
the
do something
World,
different.
Air Meet, hop in. Like, let's do something different. So what are your advice in
Yeah.
convincing the people who don't want to change?
Yeah, that's the inertia to change is a big issue, whether it be with technology or any number of other things. People get into a particular where people humans are habits. We form habits and we like to stick with those, and because of that, we're generally resistant to change. Now, different personality types are going to be a little more open, that sort of thing, but humans are generally resistant to change. So, in order to us to convince people to adopt a new tool, there's a variety of things you could do. You can pandemics cause people to adopt new tools, but that's not exactly the best option. What we have to do is we have to introduce it, and we have to show that it's actually better than the previous, right? And and even then, the majority of people will probably be okay with it, but even then you're going to have some people who are going to have opposition to it, just because it's something new, it's something different, it's something they haven't experienced, and that's just human nature. And so my advice to you would be not to stop trying, but to just as you built buy-in with the administrators to purchase the software or the tool or that sort of thing, you also have to do that with the students. You have to then, okay, to some extent sell them on the idea of trying something new, because they get stuck in the rut of showing up and an extemporaneous presentation spewing at them for however long, and then they regurgitate it on their test. They get used to that idea, and we know that that's not the best or not the only way to instruct and to teach. And so that's my advice, is recognizing that they also have to buy into it as well, and doing some steps to help with that would be my recommendation.
Thank you.
Yep. What is the ideal number of attendees for a virtual meeting? Uh, that depends. My answer to how many attendees is the right number, if you pin me down and force me to tell you what's the right number, I usually say somewhere between 5 and 7, because that's what groups and teams research says the optimal number of people in a group for most tasks. However, I don't like saying that in general as a general rule, because your purpose should drive the number of people you need. Okay, so if your purpose is brainstorming and you're going to do it in a collaborative way, more people is actually usually better. We've heard of this thing called crowdsourcing, right? There's a reason why we have it and why it exists, because it does actually work. And so if you're brainstorming, a larger group is probably a good idea. But if you're making a decision and there are 3 or 4 stakeholders, but you don't want or need everybody to weigh in on the decision, it's probably better to have a smaller group. Okay, because you don't have time for everybody who might be affected by the decision to weigh in on it, right? And so it's one of those things where you have to right size your meeting. That was what the 29 pre-COVID recommendation about right sizing your meeting is really about. Define your purpose, and then go ahead and invite the people that will allow you to accomplish that purpose, right? Rather than inviting whoever you think might fit for the meeting before you even define what your purpose is. So, Chelsea, you say, what generally shouldn't be an email and what should be a meeting? How do you make this call? This goes right along with the purpose thing, right? I actually wrote something on this recently because they were asking about this. I think it's something we talk about in the book. I usually ask people to ask 2 questions. What is the purpose? Okay, which we already mentioned just now, right? And then the second question is, do I need other people to interact in order to accomplish this purpose? Right? Do I need information that's the question. Do I need people to interact? And that usually refers to, does this person need to bring information that I need to know? Do these people need to weigh in on the decision if it is a decision-making meeting? That second question is going to tell you whether or not it's a meeting or whether it's an email. If the purpose, if you say the purpose is I need to share this information, and you say, do people need to interact in order to get this information? No, probably not. And so in that case, it can be an email or it can be another form of communication that maybe you have, some way to require people to, to read something, whatever it may be. There are other forms of communicating that are more efficient if it's just a sharing of information. But it's really about what's your purpose and do people need to interact in order to accomplish that purpose? Great question. Other questions for me? I have a regular meeting. So this is Tammy. I have a regular meeting with staff to check in and make sure my team, 7 people, has some face time with each other. It has become tedious. Any recommendations for less formal meetings? So that kind of has 2 parts to it. It's getting some face time with each other, and then there's this regularly scheduled meeting has become stale, right? So those are actually 2 issues, right? One is people need opportunities to socially interact, and your team will actually start to be more divisive and less cohesion if they don't have times to have small talk, interaction, conversations. And I know nobody wants any more virtual meetings, but what I recommend in that regard is start your meeting off with the question, how are you doing? Right? In that first 5-minute grace period that you're waiting for people to come from their back-to-back meetings, right? Ask people how they're doing. Allow some small talk to occur, which actually the data suggests actually enables a more positive meeting experience. So small talk actually matters, and it satisfies that need for some social interaction. As for the stale meeting, right? We all have some of them, that standing meeting that we have every week that the agenda has been set for the last decade, and we come to that meeting and we often leave the meeting feeling like it was a waste of time. One of the first things I recommend people to do is look at your schedule. If you're overloaded with meetings, look at your schedule and look at your standing meetings, and do a refresh. In other words, take a look at that meeting. What are you trying to accomplish? Go back and ask yourself, what is the purpose of this meeting? What are we trying to accomplish in this meeting? And are we still accomplishing what we set out to do? It's not me saying cancel the meeting. It means go back and revisit the purpose for which you are calling that meeting, and make sure that you define that once again to your people, allowing them to then participate in a way that's consistent with the purpose for which you called the meeting originally. And that can be a nice way to refresh those standing meetings that we have on our agenda. It also could be a nice way to revisit the purpose and say, you know what, we have this standing meeting and I don't think we need this standing meeting. That happens sometimes. I've had people say, you know what, I don't think I need it. And that's okay. But you might say, yeah, I know we really absolutely need this, but we need to refresh the purpose. We need to refresh the aims. We need to maybe blow up the agenda and change the agenda to be something a little bit different. And every standing meeting has a little bit different kind of focus and that sort of thing. So if you want specific feedback on your standing meeting, I'm happy to chat about that later. But that's my general idea: is revisit it, think about how to adjust it, how to change it to make it what you intended it to be in the first place. Good question. Robinson, you asked, how does virtual meetings change the way we connect, build rapport with our coworkers? For example, people are seeing our home, kids or elements in our homes that may never have been brought up in person. Yeah, there's an interesting story about that. So it's fascinating, right? When we first went to kind of the shutdown world, we then suddenly had a window into the worlds of our employees, right? The people that we work with. We started to realize, oh, I didn't know Bob had children. Or, you start to learn things about people that you didn't ever know before. Or I didn't know, Susan liked to play guitar because she got 3 guitars hanging behind her head. Or maybe it's not Susan. Maybe it's, Susan's partner. You don't. So there's things you start to learn. And so my advice to people is embrace that. Right? If someone is willing to open up their world to you and not putting a filter on, if they put a filter on, then clearly maybe they're in their kitchen, or they're in the nursery, or they're who knows where they are. It doesn't matter, right? But if they open the window to their world, don't ignore it. Right? When the cat walks across the screen, the worst thing you can do is ignore it. You say, "Hey, what's your cat's name?" Embrace it a little bit. Embrace humanity. Now, it may derail your meetings occasionally, right? And even though I say in my presentation, try to avoid distractions, there's only so much we can do, right? We can't control the cat. We can't control the kids. You can't control, there's a lot of things that are out of our control, and they were out of our control even before we were on virtual meetings, by the way. So this is okay. All right. So don't feel too bad when distractions happen, but own it, right? Own it and embrace it and ask about it. And so in my book, I actually talk about, I was doing a presentation, a virtual presentation much like this. And I thought it went really well. The students seemed like they were interacting. We're talking about being, going on to graduate school and becoming PhDs and all this kind of fun stuff, right? And then I got an email later from the presenter, said, it was great, thank you so much. He said, however, the first thing they asked about afterwards was, does Dr. Allen like the Twilight movies and books? Because if you look it on my corner over here, I left them there because this is the story. I have the Twilight books, right? And I know some people love them and some people hate them, but yeah, I've read them and I've watched the movies, and it's okay, right? It's okay. I'm a recovering Twi fan, right? Twihard, I forget what they call it. Anyway, it's okay to embrace the little bit of humanity in who we are, right? And so I kept that there, even though I could have put, another textbook, because I've got plenty of them, there to really sterilize my environment. But some of those things it's really good to kind of share who we are if you're comfortable doing that. But that's the key to remember. If they're comfortable doing that, then embrace that. If you're not comfortable doing that, don't push someone to share information that they don't want to share, obviously, right? So, Sharona, is that how I say your name? You have your hand up, and I wanted to make sure I got your question answered.
Yeah, I wasn't sure how to write it up, my question. I guess I'm wondering if you have any tips or techniques for if the different dynamics, if you're having a meeting with people versus maybe a new group that comes, a new group of people who may not know each other, how sort of some ideas with Zoom.
Yeah, great question, because I think one of those, that's a question I get when people talk about this issue of Zoom fatigue, where you're seeing yourself on camera and you're seeing everybody else on camera, but just it's a group of people you know really well. My advice with you know people pretty well, and you know that everyone's a little bit Zoom fatigued, and you know them well enough that when they're smiling, you can tell when they're smiling, when they're talking, and when they're upset, you can tell they're upset. So you've learned their vocal cues. Then either turn off the camera or use the phone, because that's actually going to make it more comfortable, right? Because you're not on. Because when the camera is on, you're on. But when you do that, make sure everybody embraces that, because you don't want to have one person sitting there with the camera on and everyone else is not, right? But that's a team who knows each other and knows them very well. Because if you don't know each other, you really got to have the camera on, because that rich medium where you got the hand gestures and the nods and the roll of the eyes and other things of that nature, you have to have that. So for new teams, I strongly encourage camera on. For teams that have been established and have been around for a long time, right? If Zoom fatigue is really starting to bother them, it's okay to take a break from the camera every now and then. Okay, but my general advice, based on the science, is that the camera is usually your friend, even though it can create a heightened awareness of how you look and and that sort of thing. It's usually your friend because you need those nonverbal cues. But for teams that have been around a lot and know each other, you don't need those nonverbal cues as much as for a new team. So that would be my general advice there. So, good question. Other questions for me? Let's see.
Hi, sorry. I was
trying
to
go ahead.
type fast enough to get your attention, but maybe that's another question. I work with students a lot as an academic advisor, and there are concerns about privacy, even legality, about asking students to have their cameras on. But we know that, especially in classrooms and advising meetings and things like that, the cameras are very useful to have that rapport. How do you recommend balancing those two concerns? Or how do you recommend having an effective meeting with lots of interaction with cameras off?
Those are two big questions, though, right? One is how do I address it when the issue of camera and privacy and so forth, and then how do I have an effective non-video meeting? So and not an in-person either, so just an audio only meeting. So first, in terms of the camera, whenever I ask a group to turn on the cameras, I always say, if you are comfortable with this, please turn on your camera because I'd like to see you and the nonverbal communication that you will share as we interact. And that's where I leave it. And that usually protects you and them, because if they're not uncomfortable with it, they won't turn it on, right? And I've run that language by my legal department before I started asking it, because I wanted to make sure that, again, like you, I don't want to make anyone feel uncomfortable, for that matter, but also don't want to dabble in privacy issues, right? I don't want to mess with that in any way, shape, or form. So if people are uncomfortable with it, make sure that they know you do not have to turn your camera, but I would really like it if you could. You know, if you're willing, please turn on your camera. I think it makes for a more meaningful conversation. I can see you, but if you're uncomfortable with that, please do not. Right, and then leave it at that. So that's my advice. And again, that goes well with my legal team, and that sort of thing. When it comes to audio, I'm going to go back to what I said to Sharona. If you know the person really well, then audio is fine. It'll work okay. That's what the data suggests. However, the data does suggest that for teams that are new or novel, or for one-on-ones where you're meeting a person for the first time, the camera is about 30 to 40% worse in terms of overall ratings of satisfaction and effectiveness when the video's off, when it's just audio. 30 to 40% worse. So that's where it gets difficult. I mean, and think about you, Ben, when you've got students that you're meeting with for the first time, that's rough, right? Because you know that you're going in, if you're going into an audio meeting, you know you've got to up your game in order to make sure that you're not losing a lot of information that you really need. And so my advice is, one way to bridge the gap in that 30 to 40% is to actually use more audio cues, right? So you may normally talk in a more monotone, I don't know, but if your normal talking voice, you actually might want to augment it. When you're happy, you want to use more terms that indicate your happiness, your enthusiasm. When you are wanting them to share, you want to be more encouraging. So you're more effusive in your approach to communicating in audio only, because you only have your voice. You only have that to communicate. So that would be my advice. That's one way that I know of to fill that gap. But it's not perfect, right? Because it's just it's hard. So great. Let's see. We've got several that came in. Is it possible, says Liz, is it possible on Zoom to prevent people from talking over one another? Not out of rudeness, just tech awkwardness, lag, etc. If you're the moderator, yeah, you can push the mute all button. Or you can mute one person. If someone's just going off, you can ask them to mute, or you can mute them if you are the host. If you're not, then you're kind of stuck. You can't force them to mute. You can't force the mute button on them, right? So that's a tech challenge at least in Zoom, right? In other, I think Microsoft Teams has the host can mute all. I think but each different software has a slightly different process for muting people and not muting people and so forth. So I think you kind of have to get to know your tools. Now, as for making it awkward, it's if someone's going off on a monologue, right, and it's the same one you've heard every week for the last 10 years, there's other ways that you can deal with that don't require muting someone. Because if you mute them, they might not realize, they may have thought, oh, my stupid audio thing, they might not realize that someone muted them, but eventually they'll wise up to it. and it could get awkward really fast. And so my advice, if rather than a technological option, would be to engage in what I call procedural communication. Okay, and this requires you to have done some other things, like having an agenda where you have certain topics that you're planning to discuss. Even if the agenda is just a verbal one, we're talking about this today, right? If it's just the one thing, great, tell them that we're going to talk about this today. If they go off over here, but you told them at the beginning you're talking about this today, you could say, I really appreciate your comments, and what I'd like you to do is can we parking lot that and schedule another time to talk about that specific issue. Today we're talking about this. And if you do that in a polite way, that's called procedural communication. It pulls them back into the focus or the purpose for which the meeting was called. But again, that assumes you have a purpose. Maybe you have an agenda. So it's, again, to use procedural communication effectively, you've got to have done some of the best practices leading up to it. Otherwise, procedural communication doesn't help you at all. If you don't have an agenda, you can't point to it and say, we're not on the agenda. You can't actually bring them back to what the focus was. So again, that's the more humane way to end a monologue or to stop a complaining cycle or that sort of thing that might be going on in a meeting. But again, you have to do some of the best practices leading up to that in order to make it effective. Okay, great question. Gosh, I love answering these questions. You're all asking really, really wonderful questions, and I'm glad I'm able to answer many of them with some of the data that we've collected and some of the answers that are in the book as well. So, Luanda, you may say in mid or to large meetings, when should you use, or for a specific topic, should you use the webinar style meeting or Zoom interactive meeting style? Okay, yeah. So once you start getting a larger meeting, right, you're now talking more about more of a presentation type situation. So you got to think about when I say meeting, I often am referring to in times when there's interaction, right, where you're actually collaborating on something. You're talking about something with each of the different stakeholders contributing to that. So that's when I think of a meeting, that's when I think of a meeting is more like. However, a lot of our meetings have presentations embedded within them. We may still have that interaction, but we're doing this presentation and then we're going to have the interaction, right? Or we're doing this interaction, then we're going to have a presentation. Well, when you have those sorts of environments, it's important to use the technology to your advantage. So if you know the whole purpose of the meeting is entirely a presentation, and there's going to be 200, 300, 500, whatever number of people, then you might, as you get to the larger numbers, a webinar style or or an approach that allows them to enter information via chat but not unmute and chime in is going to be necessary. Not so often because they're going to unmute and chime in, because what typically happens, they usually don't say anything. But what's more likely to happen is they're going to leave their mute button off, and then all the background noise, and you're going to have that sort of thing going on in the entire time. And with 200 people, there's going to be people that won't even know how to turn the mute on, right? And so you're going to have to be more active in the controlling of the environment the larger the number of people, and that gets hard for a single person. If you're the presenter and you're also the administrator, and you're also if you're doing all those roles in a larger presentation, it gets really difficult. So that's why I think a webinar style may be more ideal in those situations, right? But if you're in a smaller, medium-sized meeting, right, and you're going to have some interaction part and you're going to have some presentation part, then you probably still need to be in a Zoom interactive meeting situation. But in those situations, I often advise not having the presenter also be the administrator, right? So having someone else be the host of the meeting who can ask people to mute, who can monitor the chat and make sure that key questions are answered later on. So having someone else to assist the presenter, so that way they're not trying to keep track of everything, which is what Clemente and other is doing for me today. So, among other things, because he's awesome. Okay, but that was a great question. I think that if you were to boil it down to a shorter answer, because that was kind of long-winded, I apologize. It would be, take a moment to think about what is the nature of the interaction that's going to happen here. What is the nature of the meeting that I'm doing, and do a little planning. Because especially with those larger meetings, because if you're a company and or an organization and you're paying everyone's salary and you're bringing 200 people into a meeting, that's a lot of money that you're throwing out the window. And if your meeting is garbage, you've just wasted a lot of money, right? And so I think my advice there is, for larger meetings, it's really okay to build in some prep time. So that way you take into consideration some of the things that I've mentioned here, but others that you'll think of that I wouldn't necessarily know because I don't know your organization the way you do. So, great question. Can you give the links to the research on camera efficacy? Yes, I will get that to you. We talk about it in the book, and I don't know if the references are in the book or whether they may not be. So yes, the theory that goes with that is called media richness theory. And there's a lot of work on that. Some have said it's no longer a valid theory. Everybody has their own pet theory, but regardless, if you look up media richness theory and you look up camera versus no camera, that sort of thing, a lot of it will start to pop up. Some of it's good, some of it's not so good. So if I after the call, I'll look some up, or maybe Clemente will send some out to y'all. So I'm not sure if I got all the questions that were in the chat. Let me see here. Telling everyone that we got that one. What is the balance? So this is Winter. What is the balance between engaging with coworkers and the desire to keep your cameras on with managing homework balance? For example, having children in the background and the distraction that may pose for others in the meeting. Yeah, so again, I wish I had an infinite amount of time, but one of the things that I mentioned in the 2019 best practices that still applies was minimizing distractions, right? So if you know that there's nothing you can do to change the fact that you have little ones running around in the background, okay, then I normally don't, from a visually pleasing perspective, virtual backgrounds are kind of that can, depending on the system and depending on the software, may not work that great. But that can, if you have a headset like mine, it's canceling all that noise around you. And so, yeah, put up a virtual background that reduces distractions. So I always advise, if you can, do what you can individually to reduce the distractions, right? That the best you can. But I also tell a story about my daughter who always would come in, when they're now able to go back to school, but she would always come in and she would want to give me a hug or a kiss and that sort of thing, because she loves daddy, and I'm okay with that. And I remember getting frustrated with her and saying, honey, don't keep bothering me. I'm on calls. And then I felt really bad, right? For my little one who just wants to hug daddy. I mean, come on, how long is that going to last, right? And so I then realized, okay, I needed to be a little more, embrace humanity a little bit more in my own home, right? And allow that to happen. So there may be no way to avoid some of those distractions, but do the best you can, right? Put a virtual background up so that way the kids running back and forth with soccer ball or whatever are no longer there, right? For the people to see. Do what you can, but also it's okay if the little ones join in the camera, or turn off your camera if you're concerned about privacy in relation to that. If you don't want them to be on camera, I understand that. That's and if you're concerned about it, let people know. Say, hey, I'm off video right now because I have my little ones running around and I don't want them to be distracting, right? Just own it and say it, and everyone should be more understanding, given that we've all now experienced this. But one thing I'll add is, historically speaking, and I'll admit that I was at fault with this before, but we would have people that would occasionally work from home, and we joke about, oh, they're at home and they're jammies, just kicking it back, not really working hard. Isn't it so different now that many of us have had an experience of working from home now and realized that it's not as easy as it may have sounded when we would joke about the people working at home and just kicking it back with with their beverage and not working. It's interesting that bias existed, and I'm curious as to whether that bias is going to continue or return, because I'll admit I'm human, and I was a problem, and I think our perspective hopefully has changed on people working from home. Zeta, I'm not sure if I'm saying your name right. I apologize, but much harder, much longer days, as you have said. Yep, agreed.
I think those were all the questions. Thank you very much. We appreciate your time and giving us some strategies on how to make virtual meetings better. We'll be sending out the event recording as well as some additional resources after the meeting, most likely by tomorrow morning. So again, thank you, Dr. Allen, and thank you everyone for attending today's meeting.
Thanks for having me.
Some of our other meetings.
Great.
Take care, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.